The alien empire had annihilated 400 human colonies in less than 6 months. Every fleet humanity sent was torn apart before it even reached the battle line. Every distress signal went silent. Every hope of survival evaporated into the cold dark of space. The galaxy declared humanity extinct. They were wrong. If you love stories where humanity refuses to die, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to HFY Endurance Tales, and drop a comment telling us what you think happens next. Because what humanity did inside those black holes will change everything you thought you knew about survival. Now let's step into the void together and find out what was waiting on the other side. The war had no dramatic beginning. There was no single moment when humanity looked across the stars and decided to fight. It started slowly, the way all extinctions do, quietly, methodically, without mercy. The Verk hegemony had been expanding for 11,000 years before they found Earth's colonial network. They were not cruel by nature. They were simply efficient. When a species could not be assimilated into their biological hierarchy, it was catalogued, contained, and eventually erased. Not out of hatred, out of administration. Commander Darian Cole had read every classified file on the Verk. He had studied their military doctrine, their fleet compositions, their communication protocols. He had stood in the war rooms of 3 different deep space commands and watched senior officers argue about negotiation, while the Verk dismantled human civilization one colony at a time. Cole was 43 years old. He had dark circles under gray eyes that had not seen a full night's sleep in over 2 years. He wore no medals. He had earned plenty, but he stopped wearing them the day New Brisbane was glassed from orbit, the day he realized that medals were something living civilizations gave each other, and humanity was no longer sure it qualified. He was standing in the observation bay of the deep space installation codenamed IRONVEIL when the last major human fleet engagement ended. He watched the tactical readout feed. He watched the blue markers, human ships, wink out one by one, like lights being switched off in an empty building. When the final marker disappeared, the room went so quiet that Cole could hear the ventilation cycling. Nobody spoke for almost 3 minutes. Then Admiral James Harwick, the oldest man in the room and the one who had authorized the engagement against Cole's explicit recommendation, walked to the viewport and stared into the dark. His voice was barely above a whisper when he finally said, "We can't win a conventional war against them." Cole looked at the dead tactical board and said, "No, we never could." It was not an argument. It was not blame. It was just the truth arriving too late, the way truth usually does. IRONVEIL was located in the outer edge of the Kepler Dark Zone, a region of space that even the Verk treated with navigational caution due to its extreme gravitational irregularities. 3 massive black holes formed a loose triangle in the zone's center, catalogued as KDZ-1, KDZ-2, and KDZ-3 by human astronomers decades before the war. Navigational hazards, nothing more. Cole had been thinking about them for 14 months. The idea had started as a desperate thought at 3 in the morning, the kind of thought a man has when every rational option has already failed. What if the thing that made a place impossible to survive and also made it impossible to attack? What if the most dangerous real estate in the galaxy was also the safest? He had spent those 14 months turning that 3 in the morning thought into engineering specifications. He called the project Dead Signal. The brass called it a suicide mission and buried the proposal twice. Cole rewrote it twice. The 3rd time he walked it into Harwick's office with 12 engineers, a theoretical physicist named Dr. Raymond Voss, and a single sentence that ended the argument. If we fight them in open space, we lose everything. If we disappear into somewhere they cannot follow, we keep enough to fight back. Harwick had approved dead signal that same afternoon. Cole suspected it was less about belief in the plan and more about the fact that there were no other plans left. The engineering challenge was staggering. Surviving inside the photon sphere of a black hole, the boundary just outside the event horizon where light itself moves in circles, required solving problems that theoretical physics had described, but practical engineering had never attempted. The gravitational shear at that depth would tear conventional hulls apart in minutes. The tidal forces would compress a standard vessel like paper. The time dilation effects would desynchronize all standard communication and navigation systems. Dr. Voss solved the shear problem first. He designed a layered hull system he called the gradient shell, a series of independently articulating pla. Tests composed of a neutron-dense composite material that could redistribute gravitational stress across its entire surface rather than absorbing it at fixed points. It was, Cole thought when he first saw the prototype, the ugliest ship he had ever looked at. It was also the strongest thing humanity had ever built. The communication problem took longer. Inside the photon sphere, standard subspace frequencies were bent, scattered, and absorbed. Nothing got out cleanly. Nothing got in cleanly either, which was exactly the property Cole intended to weaponize. But it meant the installations needed their own internal communication architecture that did not rely on straight-line signal propagation. That solution came from an unexpected source. A young signals engineer named Private Marcus Webb, 26 years old, who had been assigned to dead signal more or less by accident when his previous unit was destroyed at the Callisto line. Webb proposed using the black hole's own gravitational lensing to curve their internal signals around the photon sphere like a rail. The signals would travel in arcs rather than lines, bouncing through the curved spacetime the way sound bounces through a canyon. Cole had looked at the proposal for a long time before he spoke. Then he said, "Make it work." Webb made it work in 11 weeks. By the time the last human fleet was destroyed in open engagement, dead signal was not just a proposal anymore. 3 installations, codenamed Graveyard 1, Graveyard 2, and Graveyard 3, were already under construction inside the photon spheres of KDZ-1, KDZ-2, and KDZ-3, and humanity had just given itself one last impossible advantage. The Verk thought they were chasing a dying species toward extinction. They had no idea they were pushing humanity into the most dangerous fortress ever built. Because the dead colonies were not silent. They were listening. They were building. And they were almost ready to answer. The first year inside the photon sphere nearly broke them, not because of the Verk. The Verk did not know where they were. The Verk, for the first time in 11,000 years of expansion, had lost track of an enemy. That alone was a victory of sorts, small, cold, but real. What nearly broke them was everything else. Graveyard 1 housed 412 personnel when its outer blast doors sealed for the first time. Engineers, soldiers, physicists, systems operators. The best Cole had been able to pull together before the retreat routes closed. They lived in a pressurized installation that felt less like a space station and more like the inside of a submarine that someone had welded to the frame of a nuclear reactor. The gradient shell groaned constantly under gravitational stress, a low, deep sound that the crew called the tide, because it came and went in long, slow cycles as the installation moved through its orbital path inside the photon sphere. Time moved differently here. Not dramatically, they were not experiencing science fiction levels of dilation, but enough to matter. For every 31 days that passed inside Graveyard 1, approximately 33 days passed in normal space. It was a small difference. Over months and years, it would compound into something significant. Cole made sure every person on the installation understood this from day one. They were not just isolated from the galaxy. They were slowly drifting out of sync with it. He told them this in his first address after the doors sealed. He stood in the main operations bay, a long room with curved walls that always felt slightly wrong because the gravitational gradient made every surface feel like it was tilting 2 degrees in a direction that had no name, and he spoke without notes. "We are not hiding," he said. "Hiding is what you do when you plan to come out and go back to the way things were. That option is gone. What we are doing is building. We are building something the Verk have never faced because they have never had to face it, an enemy that operates from inside the one place in the universe where their sensors go blind." He paused and let the low groan of the hull fill the silence. "They think we're dead. Good. Dead men don't have to play by any rules, Doctor." Voss, standing near the back of the room, had written in his personal log that night, "Cole doesn't inspire people by making them feel safe. He inspires them by making them feel necessary. That's rarer, and in this particular situation, it's the only kind of inspiration that works." The Singularity Broadcaster project began 6 weeks after the doors sealed. The theoretical foundation had been Cole's starting point. The concept that a black hole was not just a gravitational hazard, but an energy source of almost incomprehensible scale. Hawking radiation, the slow thermal leak that every black hole emits as particle pairs are separated at the event horizon, had been a theoretical curiosity for over a century. Nobody had seriously attempted to harvest it because the energy density per square meter was extraordinarily low in practical terms. But Cole was not thinking about powering a city. He was thinking about powering a signal. Dr. Voss designed the collection architecture. A vast mesh of energy capture filaments deployed in a cone shape, extending toward the event horizon itself, close enough to intercept the Hawking flux without crossing the point of no return. The engineering margins were, in Voss's own words during the first briefing, criminally thin. The filaments had to be maintained at a precise distance from the horizon. Too close and they were lost. Too far and the collection efficiency dropped below operational threshold. Cole assigned Marcus Webb to the deployment problem. Webb, by now promoted to lieutenant and running a team of 9 signals engineers, spent 3 weeks on the math before he came to Cole with an answer that looked wrong until you followed it all the way through. "We don't deploy fixed filaments," Webb said, spreading a holographic layout across the planning table. "We deploy orbital ones. We let them ride the photon sphere's natural orbital path and use the orbital velocity to compensate for the collection variance. The geometry is different every cycle, but the integrated collection stays within tolerance." Cole studied the layout for a long time. How long to build? 18 months for the first generation array. Maybe 12 if we strip non-essential systems and redirect the fabrication teams. "Strip the non-essentials," Cole said. "Build it in 12. They built it in 11. The first successful Hawking flux collection test ran on a cold morning. Though morning, inside the photon sphere, was a social convention rather than an astronomical one, with Cole, Voss, Webb, and about 60 others crowded into the power monitoring station. When the energy readings climbed into the operational band for the first time, nobody cheered. They had learned over the past year and a half to distrust good news until it stayed good for at least 24 hours. It stayed good for 72. Then Webb's team spent 4 months solving the transmission problem. The broadcaster itself was not a conventional transmitter. It did not send electromagnetic radiation. It sent something that had no common name in standard engineering parlance, a modulated gravitational wave train generated by carefully controlled fluctuations in the curvature of local spacetime around the installation. The black hole's own mass provided the medium. The collected energy provided the excitation. Webb's orbital filament array provided the carrier. The signal that came out the other end looked, to any sensor system in the galaxy, exactly like natural cosmic background variation. The kind of low-frequency, gravitational noise that the universe produced constantly, and that every civilization's sensor networks had long ago learned to filter out as irrelevant. It was invisible by design. And buried inside that invisible signal, modulated at a frequency that only the other graveyard installations were calibrated to detect, was a message. Cole composed it himself. He kept it short, Graveyard 1 to Graveyard 2 and 3. Broadcaster online. Weapon test authorized. Wait for MY Marquis sent it. Then he sat in his chair in the operations bay and stared at the curved ceiling and thought about everything that had led to this moment. 400 dead colonies. Billions of people gone. A civilization reduced to 412 people and 2 sister installations that he had not been able to speak to in almost 2 years. He thought about New Brisbane. Then he stopped thinking about the past, because the past was not going to save anyone. The response from Graveyard 2 arrived 19 hours later, perfectly timed to the signal's gravitational arc path around KDZ-2's photon sphere. 2 words: we're ready. And somewhere out in the open galaxy, completely unaware that the species they had erased was about to reach out and touch them from the inside of a black hole, the Verk hegemony continued its business of empire. They were about to get a lesson in what happens when you push humanity all the way to the edge of the universe. The edge, it turned out, had teeth. The first test was not meant to be noticed. Cole had been clear about that in every briefing. The objective of the initial broadcaster activation was calibration, not destruction. They needed to know how the gravitational wave train propagated through normal space at range. They needed to know if it held its modulation pattern across the distances involved. They needed to know if it triggered any Verk sensor response that would indicate detection. What they did not need was to announce themselves before the weapon was ready to finish what it started. Webb ran the test from a custom console he had built himself, a cluttered, cable-dense setup that the rest of the team called the Nest, in a tone that mixed affection with mild alarm. He was 28 years old now. He had the focused, slightly distant look of a man whose mind was always running 3 problems simultaneously. He calibrated the first pulse carefully. Low amplitude, short duration, targeted at an uninhabited region of the Kepler dark zone's outer boundary where there were no Verk installations and no traffic. The pulse would propagate outward, bend through the natural gravitational terrain of the zone, and arrive at its target region as a faint ripple in the curvature of spacetime, well below any threshold that Verk passive sensors were designed to flag. Or so they calculated. What happened instead became one of the most studied events in the remaining history of the war. The pulse propagated correctly for the first 400,000 kilometers. Then it encountered an unexpected gravitational interaction with a dense molecular cloud that had not been fully mapped in their pre-war stellar surveys. The interaction amplified the pulse by a factor that Webb, reviewing the data afterward, described as embarrassingly large. The amplified signal arrived at its target region not as a faint ripple, but as a significant localized curvature spike. A Verk deep range monitoring buoy at the edge of the zone registered it, not as a weapon, not as a signal. As a natural anomaly, a stellar event logged and forwarded to a Verk survey database for eventual review by an astrophysical cataloging team. Standard procedure for background gravitational events. The Verk were meticulous record keepers. They cataloged everything. Cole did not know any of this for several days. When Webb finally reconstructed what had happened from the secondary sensor data, he brought it to Cole with the kind of careful expression that meant the news was complicated. Cole read the analysis. Then he read it again. They logged it as natural, Webb said. Yes, Cole said, which means they didn't detect us as the source. Yes, but it also means the amplification effect is real and replicable. If we could target that molecular cloud intentionally, we'd get a free multiplier on every pulse, Cole said quietly. He set the report down and looked at Webb for a long moment. How many of those cloud interactions are in range? Webb had already run the numbers. He always had. 17 confirmed dense regions within propagation range of our combined broadcaster array. Each one would produce a different amplification profile, some higher, some lower, but the average across all 17 would let us hit targets we didn't think we could reach, Cole finished. Webb nodded. Cole stood and walked to the viewport that looked out into the impossible black curve of the photon sphere's inner boundary, a wall of distorted light and compressed spacetime that was both a prison and a shield. He had spent a lot of time at this viewport over the past 2 years. He had made most of his real decisions here, away from the operations bay and the tactical displays, and the weight of 400 pairs of eyes. He thought about the Verk survey database that now contained a record of humanity's first broadcaster test, a record flagged as natural, a record that would sit unread for months, possibly years, before any Verk analyst gave it a second look. Time was not on humanity's side in most respects, but in this one small way it was. Remap the target grid, Cole said. Factor in every cloud interaction. I want a firing solution that uses at least 8 of the 17 amplifiers in sequence. A sequential cascade, Webb said, working through the implications visibly. Each pulse uses the last pulse's amplified wake as a propagation channel for the next one. Can you build it? Webb was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. It'll take 6 months to model properly. You have 4. Webb built the model in 3.5. Meanwhile, on the other side of the galaxy, the Verk hegemony was dealing with a different kind of frustration. Humanity had been declared extinct in an official hegemony administrative bulletin 17 months earlier. The remaining colonial infrastructure had been cataloged for resource extraction. Survey teams had been dispatched to the more promising human-settled systems. Everything was proceeding according to standard post-pacification protocol, except for the anomalies. They were small at first. Gravitational sensor ghosts in regions where nothing should have been generating gravitational events. Navigational drift corrections that came back slightly wrong, not enough to cause immediate problems, but enough to require recalculation. Infrastructure sensors on 3 of the newly acquired human colonial stations reporting structural microvibrations that the Verk engineering teams could not source. The anomalies were logged. They were reviewed. They were attributed to a combination of factors: residual gravitational settling from the war's weapons use, calibration drift in sensors that had been operating in Hycent, rest conditions, the general instability of taking over infrastructure that had been built to human rather than Verk engineering standards. Nobody connected them to each other. Nobody connected them to the small catalogued anomaly in the Kepler dark zone. In the operations bay of Graveyard 1, Cole received the passive sensor reports Webb's team had intercepted from Verk navigational broadcasts. Encoded in the same gravitational background signal system they used for their own communications, now serving double duty as an intelligence feed. And he read about the anomalies with the quiet attention of a man who is watching seeds germinate. The Verk had built an empire on certainty, on knowing exactly where every threat was and eliminating it before it could mature. They had never fought a war they could not see. They were about to. Cole called a full senior staff meeting. In the curved briefing room of Graveyard 1, with Voss on one side and Webb on the other and 14 department heads around the table, he laid out the cascade firing solution for the first time. The room was silent for a long moment when he finished. Then Colonel Nathan Reed, the installation's senior military officer and the man who had commanded the rear guard action at the Callisto line that had allowed 17,000 civilians to evacuate before the Verk arrived, said exactly what everyone else was thinking. "Commander, if we fire this, they'll know someone is shooting at them. Eventually." "Yes," Cole said. "And when they figure out where the shots are coming from, they won't," Cole said. "Because the shots aren't coming from anywhere in their map. They're coming from a place that isn't supposed to exist, and by the time they start asking the right questions, we won't be firing one pulse at a time anymore." He let that hang in the air for a moment. "We'll be firing all 3 installations simultaneously, and by then the question won't be where we're shooting from. The question will be whether they have anything left to shoot back with." The room stayed quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was the quiet of people who had spent 2 years in the dark, finally seeing light, not the warm light of safety, but the cold, hard light of a weapon pointed in exactly the right direction. Cole had one final thing to add. "Get word to Graveyard 2 and 3, he said. "Tell them to charge their arrays. We are done being dead." The cascade firing sequence was designated Operation Dead Signal, the same name Cole had given the original project, because he believed that good names should survive long enough to mean something. It was scheduled for 72 hours after Graveyard 2 and 3 confirmed full array charge. Webb spent those 72 hours running calibration checks that he had already run 6 times before. Cole did not tell him to stop. Precision was not paranoia in this situation. Precision was the difference between a weapon and a catastrophe. Graveyard 2 was commanded by Colonel Sarah Mitchell, except that nobody used that name anymore because Mitchell had gone by Commander 2 in all broadcast communications since the installation sealed, a security protocol Cole had insisted on. She was 40 years old, former deep space tactical analyst, and according to every report Cole had received through the gravitational arc network, the reason Graveyard 2 was still operational. She had dealt with 3 separate critical system failures in the past year through a combination of engineering improvisation and the kind of calm stubbornness that Cole recognized as the same thing that had kept his own people alive. Graveyard 3 was commanded by Colonel Daniel Price, Commander 3 in broadcast protocol, 51 years old, former fleet logistics specialist, who had spent the past 2 years turning the logistical nightmare of sustaining life inside a black hole's photon sphere into something approaching an actual sustainable system. If Cole was the weapon's trigger and Mitchell was its targeting system, Price was the mechanism that made sure it had ammunition to fire. At hour 0, Cole stood in the operations bay and did not give a speech. He had given enough speeches. His people knew what this was. They had built it. They had maintained it through darkness and silence and the particular grinding weight of living inside a place that the rest of the universe believed was uninhabitable. They did not need words. They needed him to do his job. Webb, he said. Initialize cascade sequence. Cascade sequence initializing, Webb said. His voice was steady. His hands were steady. Cole had noticed that Webb's hands were always steadiest when the stakes were highest, as if his nervous system had decided that the worst possible moment was the wrong moment for trembling. The first pulse went out from Graveyard when it was not dramatic from the inside. There was no visible light, no shockwave, no sound beyond the deep groan of the G. Radiant shell responding to the momentary energy discharge. The power reading spiked across Webb's console, held, and then settled back to nominal. On the propagation display, a thin line extended outward from their position, curving through the gravitational terrain of the Kepler dark zone toward the first molecular cloud amplifier. 17 seconds later, the first amplification event registered on their passive sensors. The pulse had found the cloud. The cloud had done its work. Amplification nominal, Webb reported. Cascade channel established. Second pulse, Cole said. The second pulse used the propagation channel carved by the first. It arrived at the cloud faster and with greater coherence. The amplification effect was stronger. The second wave train that emerged from the cloud and continued into normal space carried a curvature signature that was, for the first time, genuinely measurable rather than borderline. Third pulse, Cole said. By the fourth pulse, the cascade was self-reinforcing. Each successive wave was riding the spacetime distortion carved by the last, deepening the channel, amplifying the effect. Webb had described this in his technical briefing as a gravitational resonance building toward threshold. Cole had translated that for the non-physicists in the room as the snowball that becomes an avalanche. The avalanche reached the Verk hegemony's infrastructure at the edge of the Kepler dark zone, approximately 4 hours and 17 minutes after the first pulse left Graveyard, one the Verk installation designated in their own records as Hegemony Survey Station Keth 7 felt it first. Keth 7 was a mid-sized administrative hub built into the superstructure of a former human colonial station, one of 400 that the Verk had catalogued and claimed after declaring humanity extinct. It housed approximately 12,000 Verk administrative and technical personnel. It had been operational for 16 months under hegemony control. The cascade wave arrived as a curvature event that the station's sensors registered at 0.003% above the structural tolerance threshold. That sounds like almost nothing. In practice, it meant that every load-bearing member in the station's primary framework experienced a simultaneous, uniform microcompression event. not enough to cause visible deformation, not enough to trigger emergency systems. Just enough to introduce hairline stress fractures at the molecular level into materials that had been engineered to never experience that particular type of stress. The Verk engineers on duty logged it. They flagged it for review. They attributed it to calibration drift. They were wrong, but they would not understand why for another 11 hours. Because Cole was not done. Graveyard 2 fired its first cascade sequence 6 hours after Graveyard 1's sequence completed. Commander Mitchell had spent those 6 hours letting Graveyard 1's propagation channel decay to background, a deliberate timing choice that Cole had built into the plan. 2 overlapping cascade sequences could interfere with each other in ways that were difficult to predict. Sequential activation was slower, but cleaner. Graveyard 2's target was not Keth 7. Mitchell's firing solution had been built around a different set of molecular cloud amplifiers that projected into a different region of hegemony-controlled space, a region containing 3 of the Verk's primary logistical relay stations. Relay stations were not dramatic targets. They were not the warships or the weapons platforms or the command centers that military doctrine usually prioritized. They were the unglamorous infrastructure of empire, the nodes through which supply chains, communication networks, and navigational data flowed. They were also, Cole had argued in the planning briefings, the most important targets available. You don't defeat an empire by killing its soldiers, he had told Reed during one of their late-night planning sessions. You defeat it by making its soldiers unable to get fuel, orders, and replacement parts at the same time. Mitchell's cascade arrived at the first relay station like a ghost, invisible, unflagged, just another gravitational background variation in a universe full of them. But inside the station, 17 separate systems experienced microstress events that individually meant nothing and collectively were the beginning of the end. And Graveyard 3 had not fired yet. Price was waiting. That was his job. He was always the last, and he had accepted that role with the equanimity of a man who understood logistics better than anyone alive, who knew that the third hit, landing on infrastructure already compromised by the first 2, was not the third hit in a sequence. It was the one that mattered. Graveyard 3's cascade sequence was charged, aligned, and waiting for Cole's authorization. Cole was watching the passive sensor feed from the Verk navigational broadcasts. The anomaly reports were already starting to accumulate. Keth 7 had filed 3 separate engineering flags in the past 2 hours. The relay stations in Mitchell's target zone had gone quiet, not dark, just delayed, their communication rhythms slightly off in ways that would take a Verk analyst with specific expertise to notice. Cole noticed. He picked up the broadcast handset and sent the authorization signal through the gravitational arc network to Graveyard 3. 3 words, Commander 3. Fire. Price fired. And somewhere in the administrative centers of the Verk hegemony, for the first time in 11,000 years of unbroken expansion, analysts began to look at accumulating anomaly reports and feel something they had not felt in a very long time. Uncertainty. It was small. It was early. They did not yet have a name for what was happening to them, but Cole did. He called it the beginning. The Verk did not panic. That was the first thing Cole noted when the intercepted communications started coming through in volume. And they came through in volume because the cascade's effect on the relay stations had done exactly what Cole intended. The stations were not destroyed. They were degraded. Their output was inconsistent, their timing irregular, their filtering systems subtly compromised by the microstress events running through their hardware, which meant that communications that should have been routed through encryption protocols were occasionally slipping through in forms that Webb's team could intercept and partially decode. The Verk did not panic, but they were confused. And confusion in an empire that had operated on absolute certainty for 11,000 years had an effect that panic might not have produced. It triggered an intensive internal review process that consumed enormous administrative resources. Every anomaly was re-examined. Every flagged engineering report was escalated. Teams were assembled, briefings were conducted, and the entire apparatus of hegemony bureaucratic response ground into motion. They were looking for a natural explanation because they had no framework for an unnatural one. Humanity was extinct. The hegemony's own records confirmed it. There was nothing in this region of space capable of producing coordinated gravitational events, so it had to be natural. Cole had counted on exactly this reasoning. He had spent 14 months designing a weapon that would be invisible not because the Verk lacked the sensors to detect it, but because the Verk lacked the imagination to classify it as a weapon. An empire that had never been threatened from a black hole's photon sphere had never built a threat recognition framework that included that possibility. Their blindness was not technological. It was conceptual. And conceptual blindness was the hardest kind to fix quickly. Cole gave them 3 weeks, not out of mercy, out of strategy. 3 weeks of accumulating anomalies, degraded infrastructure, and unanswerable engineering reports would do more psychological damage to a certainty-dependent empire than 3 weeks of visible explosions. Explosions had known causes. Anomalies did not. During those 3 weeks, the graveyard installations fired 18 additional cascade sequences, smaller, more targeted, carefully timed to arrive at Verk infrastructure nodes at intervals that felt random, but were actually calculated to maximize cumulative structural fatigue, while remaining individually below the threshold that would trigger emergency response protocols. Webb called it playing the long chord. You pressed each note lightly, and the individual notes were unremarkable. But the chord they formed together vibrated through everything. On day 19, the first Verk dreadnought experienced a structural failure. It was not Graveyard's most spectacular target. It was a logistics support vessel, heavy, slow, enormously important to fleet supply chains, and constructed on a frame that had been absorbing microstress events through 6 relay station connections over the course of 2 weeks. The failure was a delamination event in the vessel's primary load-bearing spine, triggered when the ship executed a standard navigational maneuver that applied lateral stress to structure that was no longer rated for it. The vessel did not explode. It cracked. A long, catastrophic fracture ran through its midsection, and the ship broke in two with the slow, terrible dignity of something that had been enormously strong and was now simply done. The Verk fleet response was immediate. Support vessels were dispatched. The crew was recovered. An emergency engineering review was ordered. 3 days later, a second vessel experienced a similar failure. Different class, different region of space, same root cause. Then a third. Now the Verk were not confused anymore. Now they were looking at a pattern, and the pattern did not have a natural explanation that their best analysts could construct. Structural failures of this type in this sequence in the See specific classes of vessels. The statistical probability of natural causation was, according to the hegemony's own internal analysis that Cole would not read until 2 years later, approximately 1 in 400 billion. They were being attacked. They just did not know by what, from where, or how to stop it. The High Fleet Command of the Verk hegemony convened an emergency session. Cole knew this not because he had an agent in their command structure, but because 3 of the relay stations in Mitchell's target zone were still degraded, and the emergency session's coordination traffic was leaking through their compromised filters in fragments that Webb's team assembled like a puzzle over 48 hours. The hegemony's conclusion was not wrong, exactly. They determined that the structural failures had a common propagation vector, gravitational in nature, low frequency, originating from the general direction of the Kepler dark zone. They recognized correctly that this was the region of space where humanity's last known fleet movements had occurred before the war ended. They drew the obvious conclusion. A human automated weapons system, a doomsday device of some kind, had been activated in the Kepler dark zone. Something prepositioned before humanity's extinction, designed to fire without human oversight. An automated system could be found. An automated system could be destroyed. They dispatched a high fleet task force. 47 vessels, including 8 of their heaviest dreadnoughts. The mission: enter the Kepler dark zone, locate the source of the anomalies, and eliminate it. Cole received warning of the task force's deployment through the intercepted communications 12 hours before it departed. He called the senior staff together and told them what was coming. "They think we're a machine," Reed said. "Yes," Cole said. "And when they get into the zone and can't find a machine, they'll start looking harder. And looking harder means getting closer to the black holes." Cole paused. "Which is where we need them." The plan that Cole laid out in the next 3 hours was the most technically demanding thing Webb had ever been asked to build. It required coordinating all 3 graveyard installations simultaneously, not in sequence but in true parallel, to generate a broad-spectrum pulse that would not merely send tremors through Verk infrastructure at a distance. It would generate something fundamentally different, something that had a name in theoretical physics but had never existed in practice. A synthetic event horizon, not a real black hole, not a singularity, but a region of localized space-time curvature so extreme and so precisely shaped that any vessel caught inside it would experience the same navigational impossibility as a vessel caught inside an actual event horizon. The mathematics of escape velocity would work against them. Standard drive systems would be pushing against a gravitational gradient they were not designed to overcome. It would not kill the fleet. It was not meant to. It was meant to hold them still. Because a fleet that cannot maneuver is not a fleet anymore. It is a target, and humanity still had weapons that were not gravitational in nature, conventional systems, maintained and ready, that the graveyard installations had never used because they had never needed to, because the gravitational broadcaster had always been enough. They would not be enough this time. This time, Cole intended to end it. Webb looked at the simultaneous activation requirements and was quiet for 45 seconds, which was, in Cole's experience, Webb's version of a very long silence. "I can build the trigger architecture," Webb said finally. "The timing synchronization across 3 installations separated by those distances. We're talking about signal travel time through the ARC network. There's an inherent delay. It won't be truly simultaneous." "How close can you get?" Webb worked the math in his head. "Within 4 seconds of simultaneity across all 3. Is 4 seconds close enough?" Webb thought about it. "For the synthetic horizon to form, the 3 pulse fronts have to arrive at the target zone within a window that allows them to constructively interfere. The window is," he paused, checking his own calculation, "8 seconds. So 4 seconds of variance fits inside an 8-second window." "Barely. Build it," Cole said. Webb built it in 36 hours without sleeping. The Verk task force entered the Kepler dark zone on the morning of the 31st day after Operation Dead Signal's first cascade sequence. 47 vessels. Cole watched their navigational signatures on the passive sensor network, each one a small distortion in the zone's gravitational background, detectable to graveyard systems even when invisible to conventional sensors. He watched them spread into search formation. He watched them probe the zone's outer regions, looking for the automated weapon system that they were. Certain was out there somewhere. He let them search for 6 hours. Then he said, "Webb, all 3 installations, activate the synthetic horizon sequence." Webb's hands moved across his console with the calm, methodical precision of a man who had built this moment from nothing and knew every piece of it. "Activating," he said. The pulse left Graveyard 1 somewhere in the ARC network. The signal raced toward Graveyard 2 and 3 and 47 Verk vessels, spread across the heart of the Kepler dark zone, continued their search, completely unaware that the space around them was about to become something that had never existed before, something there was no escape from. The edge of the universe had just become a cage, and humanity had the key. The synthetic event horizon held for 11 minutes and 43 seconds. That was longer than Webb had projected and shorter than Cole had hoped, but it was long enough. Inside those 11 minutes and 43 seconds, 47 Verk vessels went from a coordinated search formation to a state of complete navigational paralysis as their drive systems fought against a gravitational gradient that simply refused to be overcome by any thrust output their engines could generate. There was no explosion, no dramatic detonation. From the outside, from the perspective of a hypothetical observer hovering at the zone's edge, the Verk fleet would have looked exactly as it had before. Ships in formation, systems running, nothing obviously wrong. Except that none of them were moving. And none of them could. Cole did not celebrate this. He watched the passive sensor feeds and gave quiet, precise orders. The conventional weapon systems that Graveyard One had maintained and never used were activated for the first time. Long-range platforms, designed for surgical strikes rather than broad engagement, targeted the drive cores of the 4 largest Verk dreadnoughts with the specific intention of disabling rather than destroying. He had thought about this carefully. A fleet that was destroyed became martyrs and a mystery. A fleet that was disabled and retrieved, a fleet whose surviving crews could report what had happened to them, became something much more powerful. Evidence. The Verk hegemony needed to know what had happened here, not to explain it away, not to catalog it as an anomaly. They needed to know it completely and clearly and with the full weight of documented, undeniable fact. Humanity was not extinct. Humanity was inside the black holes. Humanity had turned the end of the universe into a fortress, and humanity had, from that fortress, reached out across the galaxy and broken the hegemony's most powerful fleet task force without losing a single person. 3 of the 4 targeted dreadnoughts were disabled cleanly. The 4th got lucky, a drive surge at the moment of strike that partially deflected the shot and allowed the vessel to retain partial navigational capability. Cole watched it pull free of the synthetic horizon's fading boundary on the last seconds of its existence and begin a labored, limping retreat from the zone. He let it go. That was intentional too. Someone had to carry the message home. The synthetic horizon dissipated at hour mark 11:43. The remaining vessels, 39 of 47, now capable of movement, the other 8 drifting with disabled drives, reorganized with the automatic efficiency of a military that had not forgotten how to function even in shock. Cole watched their formation shift from search pattern to protective cluster. He watched them begin recovery operations for the disabled vessels. He did not fire again. He had said what he needed to say. The response from the Verk hegemony took 19 days. It came not through intercepted communications, but through a formal, encrypted broadcast on a frequency that hegemony diplomatic protocol reserved for contact with species they considered worth speaking to. They had never used it with humanity before. They used it now. Webb decoded the broadcast in 4 hours. Cole read the translated text alone in his quarters, a small room off the main operations bay that contained a bunk, a desk, and a viewport that looked out into the photon sphere's inner boundary. He read it twice and then sat with it for a while. The hegemony acknowledged that humanity had demonstrated significant strategic capability from an unanticipated position. They acknowledged that the structural failures to their infrastructure had been deliberate and coordinated rather than natural. They acknowledged that their assessment of humanity's extinction had been premature. They were, in the careful language of an empire that had never been forced to say anything like this before, asking to talk. Cole drafted his response himself. He ran it past Reed, past Voss, past Mitchell through the ARC network, past Price. They all suggested changes. He accepted some and rejected others. The final version was 3 paragraphs long and took him 2 hours to write. The core of it was simple. Humanity would talk. Humanity would not be talking from a position of surrender, supplication, or desperation. Humanity was talking from the inside of 3 black holes, having demonstrated that it could reach out and touch hegemony infrastructure anywhere in this region of the galaxy without being detectable, traceable, or stoppable. The conversation would begin from that premise and no other. He sent it. The hegemony's reply came back in 11 days. They accepted the premise. The negotiations that followed were long and deeply strange, conducted through a gravitational arc broadcast network that the Verk's own physicists spent months trying to understand, and they did not produce a clean, tidy piece. Nothing in this situation was clean or tidy. The Verk hegemony did not become humanity's friend. The grief of 400 dead colonies did not resolve into anything that felt like justice. Billions of people were still gone, and nothing that happened in a negotiation chamber was going to change that. What the negotiations produced was something more useful than friendship and more durable than justice. They produced a new reality. The Verk hegemony retained its territory. Humanity retained its installations. A formal boundary was established, one that the hegemony agreed to maintain not because they wanted to, but because they had done the strategic mathematics and understood that the cost of attempting to violate it was not survivable. An empire that could not move a fleet through the Kepler dark zone without risking structural failure across its infrastructure was an empire that had a serious problem. An empire that knew the source of that problem was inside 3 black holes that could not be attacked, boarded, or destroyed from outside, was an empire that had learned, for the first time in 11,000 years, what it felt like to have a weapon pointed at it that it could not see coming. They learned to live with it. And humanity, 412 people in Graveyard 1, 387 in Graveyard 2, 401 in Graveyard 3, began the slow, difficult, necessary work of being something other than survivors. Cole stood at his viewport on the day the boundary agreement was formally transmitted. He looked out into the photon sphere's inner boundary, the curved wall of compressed light and distorted space-time that had been his horizon for 3 years. He thought about New Brisbane. He thought about the 14 months of early morning calculations. He thought about Webb's hands, steady on a console that had never existed before Webb built it. He thought about Reed at the Callisto line, buying time for people who had used that time to build something that changed everything. He did not feel triumphant. He was not sure triumphant was the right response to any of this. Too many people were gone for triumph. Too much had been lost for the word to sit comfortably. What he felt, standing at that viewport, was something quieter and more durable. He felt like humanity had done the one thing the Verk had never accounted for, the one variable their 11,000-year model of galactic power had not included. They had not just survived. They had found the one place in the universe where survival became leverage, where the dead end became a vantage point, where the thing that was supposed to finish them had instead become the foundation of something new. Voss appeared beside him at the viewport. They stood in silence for a while, looking at the inner boundary of the photon sphere. "You know what I keep thinking about," Voss said. "Tell me." "Hawking radiation." Voss's voice was thoughtful. "The way a black hole leaks energy, just this constant, quiet, unstoppable emission from something everyone assumes is only capable of consuming." He paused. "Seems relevant." Cole looked at the curved light, and the compressed spacetime and the impossible boundary that had been humanity's home for 3 years. "Yeah," he said, "it does." 2 years later, the first new human colonial vessel departed from a shipyard constructed in the relative safety of KDZ-1's outer orbital region, a shipyard that no Verk vessel could approach without risking the structural fatigue effects that humanity's broadcasters could generate on demand. The vessel was not large. It was not fast. It was built from materials that had been fabricated inside a black hole's photon sphere, by people who had spent 3 years learning to build things in the most demanding environment in the known galaxy. It was named New Brisbane. Commander Cole stood in the operations bay of Graveyard 1 and watched the vessel's navigational signature emerge from the photon sphere's boundary on his passive sensor display. A small, clear point of light moving outward into normal space for the first time. He watched it for a long time. Then he turned to Webb, who was sitting at his console, still the same cluttered, cable-dense setup, though it had been rebuilt 4 times in 3 years, and said, "Log it." Webb looked up, course heading. Cole thought about it. There was a lot of galaxy left. Most of it was still Verk territory. Most of it was still off-limits, still dangerous, still carrying the weight of 400 erased colonies and everything that had been lost. But most of it was not all of it. "Outward," Cole said. And New Brisbane moved outward, away from the black hole, away from the fortress, away from the event horizon, carrying the name of everything that had been taken, and the proof that what had been taken was not the end of anything. It was a beginning. If this story hit you somewhere deep, drop a comment and tell us which moment got you the most. Was it the first broadcaster pulse, the synthetic event horizon, or Cole watching New Brisbane fly free? Share this with someone who needs a reminder that even the darkest edge of the universe can become a starting point. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to HFY Endurance Tales, because we're just getting started. The void is vast, and humanity has a lot more to say.